Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Today we talk about the problem of economic growth and the influence that natural and other resources, technology, ideas, and institutions have on economic growth, which is chapter 17 in your book. So there are essentially two basic problems or two important subtopics that we will be covering. The first is an introduction to economic growth, basic definition of economic growth, trying to understand it to define it by using the categories that we already developed and hopefully understood thus far. And the second problem is the most widely used economic model to understand economic growth and the interplay and interaction between different factors influencing economic growth. That is the so-called production function. So how the tool called production function that we will define in a moment influences economic growth. How we can use that tool to better understand what's going on with economic growth. Okay, so let's get going first with the definitions. What is GDP? What is economic growth? Economic growth is just a change in the real GDP figures. So that's what it is. So economic growth is a change in the level, positive change in the level of income of any given country. And since we know that the income is measured through GDP, you'll remember what is the basic definition of GDP. It's the value of all final goods and services produced in a given country. So the total amount of stuff, of consumer goods that we have, so that's the GDP, real GDP. Real GDP is a market value of final goods and services corrected for inflation. So I can say that the real GDP is just a quantity of stuff produced independently of price or corrected for the price change. So then you can say that economic growth is a positive change in the level of real GDP. Positive change in the quantity of goods and services produced in a given country. In a given time period, usually annually or quarterly, every 3 months. But for the purposes of the long-term economic statistics, we usually talk about annual changes in real GDP. So that's the most widely used measure of economic wealth, or to be more precise, of the standard of living. So that's what we are interested in. The measure of standard of living is real GDP, and economic growth is measured by a change in real GDP from one point to another. So you have $1,000 of income in 1 year, it increases to 1,100, so your real GDP increased 10%. So you can say that your economic growth was 10%. There is another measure which is in most cases shows the similar results, but not always. That's per capita real economic growth. So per capita real GDP, that's the first category that we have to define. Real GDP per capita. That's the quantity of stuff that we have divided up by the number of people among whom the stuff has to be divided. So that's the income, average income per person in a given country. And that's the best measure of of the standard of living. The most precise one is the real GDP per capita. Why is this measure even better than real GDP? Because it controls for population. So China and America have a similar real GDP, which means that the similar quantity of stuff is produced and available to their populations. So you can say their real GDPs are comparable. But America is much wealthier country than China because it has much less population, 4 times less population. So that means that American real GDP per capita is 4 times or 5 times higher because you have to divide the same amount of stuff among 320 million people instead of 1.5 million. Okay, so then if that's the case, then the real GDP growth would be a change, annual or quarterly change in the quantity of stuff or real GDP that is available to any one individual. So if your average income of an average person in America increases from, let's say, 45,000 to 50,000, then you have a real GDP growth per capita, which would be whatever it is, 45 over 50. That percentage. So it would be 20%, I think. So real GDP per capita is controlled for population. So when you talk about per capita real economic growth and absolute economic growth, the difference for any given country may occur only if there is a mismatch between the population growth and real GDP growth. So that sometimes happens, but doesn't happen too often. So when, in terms of real economic growth, the per capita real economic growth corresponds largely to absolute real economic growth. So you see, America has now 325 million people, and let's assume that's not going to happen because we are entering a recession. But let's assume that American real GDP, the total figure of GDP, increases 3%. That's probably going to translate into comparable increase in per capita real GDP economic growth because population will increase by about as much. If it increases by less, then we will have a higher rate of per capita growth because population will be growing slower than total income, total GDP. If population increases much faster, let's say that we import overnight 2 million people, 2 million new immigrants just arrive tomorrow in America, and we have the same 3% real GDP growth, then per capita real economic growth will be lower than the absolute numbers because we will have now to divide up the same quantity of stuff among 327 million people instead of 325. Okay, so these are just some basic statistical numbers that are used to measure economic growth. Why is this important? Why would anyone bother with statistics about economic growth in the long run? Apart from the obvious use that these statistics has for what we've discussed the entire semester, essentially, policies against recession, how to deal with the problem of economic recessions and crises. So you have first to measure whether real GDP grows or increases, the short-term business fluctuations, recessions and expansions. You first have to figure out whether your economy is growing or not growing in order to intervene, to prevent a recession or to moderate a recession. Whatever theoretical model you used, Keynesian, monetarist, classical, new Keynesian, doesn't matter. You have to use the same numbers wherever your approach is. But that's just for the short-term fluctuations. So business cycle is a short-term fluctuation in real GDP growth. So that means 3 years or 4 years or 10 years from the standpoint of history, that's a short-term period. So that's one use. You need the data about economic growth to manage the short-term business fluctuations. But you need it for something else. And why is that? What is that? That's the long-term economic growth. So the small changes, when you look over a long protracted period of time, so let's say 50 years or 100 years, and then you average out the rates of growth over this same period of time. Over one period of 100 years, actually, America has been 88, 89 years in an expansion, maybe 10, 11 years, I don't know what is the precise figure, 12 years in a recession. So in the long run, this evens out. In the long run, you have some average, obviously positive growth rate. So now you may think intuitively at first sight that it doesn't matter too much whether it's 2% or 3% or 4%. I'm talking about this long-term trend, let's say over 100 years or 150 years. Because what is it? Okay, 2% wealthier or 3% wealthier, it's not such a big deal. Oh, it is. So that's a mathematical mirage that people who don't know statistics and math that they may engage in. Since we are not such people, we know that in the long run, 1 percentage point more of economic growth matters a lot. So there is one rule how to calculate one of the measures of how well you do in the long run. How much time is required for your country to double its income, to double your real GDP. So the formula is called the rule of 70, and it says that what you do, you average out your growth rate. You take the average growth rate for your country over a certain period of time, 50 years, let's say, doesn't matter, 100 years. And then you use the formula, you divide 70 by this average growth rate, and you're going to get the number of years that it takes for your country to double its real GDP. So that's the rule of 70 is the formula that calculates how many years you will need to grow at a given rate to double your income. So if your growth rate is 5%, your real GDP will double in 14 years. The formula is 70 over 5%. It's 14 years. So you go from, if you control for the population, you go from an average salary, average personal income, $3 in constant terms to $60. So the real standard of living doubles in 14 years if your economy grows by 5%. If it grows by 2%, you will need 35 years. So you will need 35 years to achieve the results, the same results that you're going to achieve in 14 years with a 3 percentage point higher growth rate. Rather, maybe even more dramatic illustration for you is imagine that we took America in the year 1900. And when you average American growth rates with all recessions, with the Great Depression, with all kinds of economic problems, with wars and so on, America had a growth rate of 3%. Average growth rate is about 3% from 1900 until today, give or take. So now, imagine that from the year 1900, instead of 3%, not 5%, instead of 3% that America had grown historically, America's growth rate was 2%. Just 1 percentage point less. You know what the real income per capita, real GDP per capita in America would have been in that case? On average, very close or equal to Mexico. Just 1 percentage point less of economic growth over a long period of time, 100 years or more, we would have been now as poor as Mexico is. America would have been like a second-rate or a third-rate economic power in the world. You see how important this is? In the long run, economic growth matters a lot. A rate of economic growth. It matters a lot whether you grow by 4% or 2% in the long run. In the short run, it might not be so critical, so you can get away with some recessions or some years of low economic growth, but longer the time horizon, the growth rates matter more and more and more. The average growth rate matters more. So bear that in mind, that this statistics is important not only as a tool of macroeconomists to understand the short-term business cycle and to figure out what to do and when to do it in terms of preventing the business cycle. It also matters a lot in terms of tracking the long-term economic well-being of the country. So here you have some examples, some recent examples about the growth rates, real GDP growth rates in America from 2006 until about 2016. And as you can see, the growth rates are not very good. You see, you have a recession in 2009, 2.8%. 2008 also negative rate of growth. Just, I don't want to scare you, but just to give you the current best assessment, what the figures for 2010 will be, they will be probably lower or much lower than for 2009. Probably we're going to be in a recession when you average the entire year to year drop in real GDP. 2019 to 2020 will be -4, -5, so on. And most of this negative growth rate in 2020, as you can guess, now will come from this complete shutdown of our economy. That everything stopped for a while, and it's gonna be on hold at least until the end of this month, possibly in some areas longer. We don't know yet exactly. It seems that the epidemic is peaking in many parts of the country, that the worst that we are about to peak, that the worst is probably behind us in some parts of the world, in some parts of the country, but nevertheless, the quarantines will stay in place until the end of the month, at least. So the estimates are that in the second quarter, April, May, and June, the real GDP will drop by 20 to 30%. That's almost a third. Now, it will recover in the third quarter once people get back to work and the economy gets going once again. We will then start recovering very sharply. So that's called the V-shape recovery. That means it's like V here. This is the drop in the economic, very sudden and very deep and very fast drop in economic activity from here to here. Let's say here it's February 2020 when everything was fine. Here, let's say it's June and July when most of the negative economic consequences of this shutdown are shown, maybe August, who knows, and then you have a quick recovery that the economy is going back to its previous level. So that's what we probably have in store for us. So the final figures will not be as horrible as this 23% drop, but nevertheless, it's doubtful whether we're gonna succeed in making up for this loss in the last 2 quarters of the year. So you see, this is the long-term trend here is not as good as it used to be before. Remember what I said just 10 minutes ago, that average growth rate over a long period of time, more than 100 years, was 3%. We didn't hit under Obama and in last few years of George W. Bush, and I may add even under Trump, now we didn't hit 3% in a single year. So that's bad news. If this trend continues, if this thing continues for next 30, 40, 50 years, America is going to become much less dominant economic power in the world. Somebody else is going to take over, whoever that might be. China, India, Japan, I don't know. But this is not good in the long run. This is like a 2% per year. That's not enough. That's the growth rate that the European Union has had for the last 30, 40 years. And that's why America so sharply diverged from Europe. So why America becomes so much wealthier than most European countries. Okay, so these are some basic statistical data. Production function. So production function is the main analytical tool that is used to study the phenomenon of economic growth and to study the factors that contribute to the economic growth. It's a functional analysis. which means that you want to understand how your independent variable, which is the real GDP, the level of output if you in your country, in the independent variable is a thing that you want to explain. And the function, it is a function of other things that are dependent variable, that are some things that you use to explain your independent variable. And these things are labor, capital, and one thing that is called technological coefficient. That means essentially technological sophistication of your economy. So you can say that the real GDP is a positive function of the amount of capital that your country has, labor, and technological sophistication that you have, the level of technological development. So the technological development augments or amplifies productivity of labor and capital, which means that the better technology, better technological tools increase productivity of labor and capital. What that means? That means that you can produce more stuff if you have a better technology, better technological processes. You can produce more stuff by using one worker or by using one additional worker sometimes. And for capital, it means that by using the same amount of machines, with the better technology, with the superior machines, of course, you can produce more real GDP, more real stuff. So that's the functional analysis. So that's a production function is a relationship or a function that specifies how technology, labor, and capital influence production or real GDP. These are the figures of the production. This is what the production function looks like. Okay, usually how this is done. You see the basic standard coordinating system. Labor is on the horizontal axis, real GDP is on the vertical axis. So this analysis is done in the following fashion, that you take one, so labor, capital, and technology are three different factors of production. Okay, so you need their cooperation in order to produce anything, in order to produce real GDP, any quantity of real GDP, you need the cooperation of these three factors. You need labor to work, you need capital. By capital, we mean machines, tools, buildings, physical infrastructure that you use as a part of the production process. And we have technology coefficient, which is a certain number that tells you how well you're using capital and labor. It's a measure of technological development of your country. You don't have to worry now about how exactly is this calculated or estimated, but you just need to know that all three variables are proportionately related to real GDP. So, which means that increase in any one of them will lead to higher real GDP, to higher productivity. Okay, so you have three factors that need to cooperate. You cannot produce anything just by telling some workers work and produce. You need to give them capital, machines, goods, and resources, and you need to use certain technology to allow the process to work. Now, whenever you use the analysis that requires cooperation of two or more complementary factors of production, that's a technical term, complementary, which means that they complement each other, that they only work in tandem, they only work together. So then the mode of analysis is something called variable proportions. So that means in order to simplify the analysis, so you want to study how changes in every one of them in isolation from all others influence real GDP production. So you want to isolate, for example, the effects of labor. How changes in quantity of labor influence real GDP. In order to do so, you have to eliminate by assumption the influence of the remaining two factors. So you remember our old principle, ceteris paribus, all other things being equal. So you decide, I'm going to keep technology and capital constant for now. I'm going to assume that they don't change. And then I'm going to study how mathematically relationship between quantity of labor or quantity of labor hours and real GDP production changes. Okay, so that's the method of analysis. That's the premise of this curve here is that the capital and technology are assumed to be fixed for now. We're going to relax that assumption in a brief while, but just for now, bear with me. For now, they're fixed, and there is only one variable factor. So these two factors, technology and capital, are defined or considered to be fixed, unchanged, and the only variable factor is labor. That's why the analysis is called the variable proportions, because we now change the proportion. When you increase labor and you retain the same amount of capital and technology, then the proportions between labor and the remaining factors changes. So that means when you say the variable proportions, that means that some factors are kept fixed and one factor is varied. So then what can you see? This is the curve, the functional relationship between labor and real GDP if technological coefficient and quantity of capital goods are kept constant. So you see that the curve changes, it flat lines. It is exponential in this first part here, and then it becomes logarithmic later on. It flattens out. So what does that mean? That means that in the first part of the curve, you have what is usually called increasing returns. That means let's assume that you start from zero. Let's say that this is a production function of a given firm. Not the macroeconomy, but the given firm, because the principle is the same. But for us, it may be easier to understand the principle just by assuming for a moment that this production function describes the relationship between labor and real GDP for a single firm. So you start from zero. You don't produce anything. You don't have labor. Then you imagine that someplace halfway to this L1 quantity of labor, you employ the first person. You see, your quantity of labor that you will be quantity of real output, quantity of real GDP that you will be producing that way will be more than half this Q1. That means that by introducing the first unit of labor, you will be producing the greatest quantity, you will have greatest marginal productivity, as we say. That means the productivity of introducing one additional unit of a factor. Imagine that here, where my cursor is your first worker, who works for you on a farm, for example. And then when you employ the second worker, let's say that this L1 is not L1, but it's the second worker whom you employ, you will see that the increase in productivity, increase in real output will be positive. You will still produce more by having two workers employed than by having one worker employed, but this increment will be lower. So what does that mean? That means that very quickly you enter the area of diminishing returns. Then you employ another person, you also have an increment by less, but less than before, and so on down the line. And imagine here where I keep my cursor that you project some quantity of labor, fifth worker, let's say here. That's your real GDP projected on the vertical axis. And then you employ one more, you almost have no increase, you almost have no increment in real GDP. That means the saturation point, it doesn't, the additional gains in productivity by varying the labor factor, by including more workers, more laborers into your labor force, will come close to zero. So that means that there are diminishing, the logic of diminishing returns. And why is that the case? Why is there the logic of diminishing returns? That's a very interesting and simple question. And that says that there is an optimal quantity of any variable factor that could be added to the production mix. Production mix is the quantity of labor, quantity of capital, and technology. So there is, if you keep two of them constant, there is an optimal maximum quantity of a variable factor that maximizes total production, real GDP. If you increase it beyond certain point, it will start decreasing. You will get less and less by investing one more unit of labor. Why is that the case? That's simply the case because maybe the easiest way to understand this is to use one example. Imagine that you want to grow corn. This production function shows you how you may grow corn. And instead of labor, you have a fertilizer. Let's say that you plant one corn stalk in a flower pot. So the factors that you need to use are some soil, flower pot, some fertilizer, and maybe water to water the plant. And then let's say that you want to increase, you're not satisfied with the corn yield that you have, with the quantity of corn. You want to make more popcorn, you want to grow more corn. And let's say that you don't have a way of increasing other factors of production, to have more flower pots or to have another corn stalk, that you want to increase your quantity of output, quantity of corn, by varying the fertilizer factor, by adding more miracle growth to your existing flower pot. And for a while you may be capable of increasing your output, your corn production, by adding a little bit more of fertilizer without changing the quantity of other factors of production. But sooner or later you will hit the wall. You will realize that you may not increase further production of corn, that you may actually burn the plant. If you push the volume of fertilizer that you are using beyond certain point, you may actually damage the plant. Those of you who ever worked in farming and agriculture know this very well. There is an optimal quantity of fertilizer that you can use. So sooner or later, if you want to keep increasing your production of corn, you will have to do something with other factors of production, to make another flower pot, to plant another corn stalk, and to start changing other factors of production. So if you keep other factors of production constant, sooner or later you will have to hit the wall of maximum possible production. So which you cannot change further. Otherwise, if this were not the case, if this law didn't stand, this law that there is one optimal maximum quantity of one factor that could be set up with all other factors fixed, you could have produced theoretically the entire supply of corn in the United States in one flower pot. If there were no optimal finite quantity of fertilizer that maximizes production of corn in your flower pot, if there were no such a limit, then you could have produced the entire world production of corn in one flower pot and get all corn subsidies. Okay, so this law is called the law of returns. The law of returns, which means that if you vary one factor and you keep all other factors constant, there is only so much that you can do. There is only so much that you can do. That in order for the conclusion, let's say the bottom line, as they say here, is that if you want real economic growth in the long run, you cannot just change and vary one of the factors. You have to vary all of three factors in tandem. So you have to increase, as your labor population increases, or the quantity of labor that you devote to production increases, you have to increase your technological sophistication and your amount of capital goods, machines, tools, buildings, roads, railways, airplanes, in order to keep up with the increased labor. So you have to increase all factors of production, their availability in the same time, if you want real economic growth in the long run. So here is is the simple change from L1 to L2. You increased your labor hours, you're going to increase production. But as we said, this is just a short-term possibility. In the long run, if you want to keep increasing your real GDP, you have to change technology and capital. And this is shown in this exhibit too. So the real economic growth in the long run is shown as a shift in the production function. So here, let's say that you can increase, instead of increasing labor, the same quantity of labor you have here, but capital changes. You have more capital goods. Imagine that for a moment you had more machines or more tools or more buildings or more factories being built. So then the capital coefficient changes. You have 2 times as much capital goods as you had before. So you will be capable of producing more goods and services, more real GDP with the same quantity of labor. So that means that the production function will shift upwards. So then if you increase from L1 to L2 here, for example, you will be capable of producing more goods on a new higher curve than on the new lower curve. So then you wouldn't need to increase to have the same amount of output here. You wouldn't need actually to increase the quantity of labor. Imagine that the quantity of capital goods hasn't changed at all. So now in order to produce, to go from Q1 GDP to Q2 here, you will have actually to increase the labor hours. You will have to work harder. So here you will have to double essentially your labor force, or to double the amount of labor hours that you to get the same quantity of real output Q2. However, here just by increasing the quantity of capital goods, you can work the same labor hours and produce the same quantity of goods. The same applies to technology. So you have a better machine, so your capital doesn't change. You have the same quantity, the same number of machines, the same number of cars, the same number of computers, the same number of all potential capital goods, but their quality changes. So this coefficient, instead of 0.4, goes to 0.5. So then what's happening is that the efficiency of the labor force, productivity of the labor force and capital goods change because they're better. When you have a better machine, technologically superior machine, that increases the productivity of machine. A better machine can produce more stuff, and also productivity of a worker who is operating the machine. Then one worker who will need 1 hour to produce 100 units of something with an inferior machine will need now 50 minutes or 40 minutes to produce. So then the same labor and the same amount of capital can produce with a better technology Q2 level of output. So you don't need to increase neither capital nor labor here to have an increase in real productivity. Technological change can do it. So this picture here is the key, one of the most important pictures and illustrations in economics that shows you how we got out of poverty in the Western world and increasingly in all other countries. By an increased series of technological revolutions, we increased the productivity of labor and productivity of capital. So now we work less than generation. My generation works far less than my generation of parents and grandparents, and your generation is going to work even less strenuously to produce the same quantity of output, because we have better capital goods and more technologically sophisticated capital goods that we use for production. Imagine just the capital goods that you and me are using right now. What are we doing? We are actually finishing the semester at University of Mary by using the online system of recording lectures and communicating via internet. So on 4 years ago, we wouldn't have had that ability. The quarantine due to the virus, we will be home, you will be losing the semester, the university will be losing the money, nothing will get done. Of course, the online communication is not the same thing as the in-person interaction, but it allows us to do, and not only us, imagine like the people who are teleconferencing in big corporations and governments who are having business meetings online every day. So the tremendous amount of value of economic production is saved by the fact that we have a much better technological uh, instruments right now than we used to have 30 or 40 years ago. So this economic downturn that is now bad would have been way worse 40 years ago because we have now some technological means to bypass some of the problems that we are facing in this extraordinary health emergency that we are facing. So that applies even more so in normal times, but it's less visible because the technological shifts, technological changes gradual, and we got used to them, and we don't perceive them as revolutionary and life saving and wealth increasing and income increasing, but nevertheless the effect is the same. The effect is the same, that in the long run, better technology allows us to work less and to spend less on capital goods by simply making the existing capital goods that we have better and better and better. And there doesn't seem to be any limit to this growth of technological gains. That's one of the beauties, that human mind and human knowledge doesn't seem to know the limits. There are physical limits to everything that we have. Number of cars and buildings in our life, and our bodies are limited, our physical existence is limited, but the amount of new knowledge that people can create, the new discoveries that people can create, although everyone's individual knowledge is limited, the collective knowledge, the collective wisdom of humanity is increasing by leaps and bounds all the time, and there is no principal limit to how high it can grow. And technological sophistication reflects this in principle unlimited growth in knowledge. So that means that economic growth in the long run can go on forever, essentially. For as long as people are biologically, genetically, epistemologically what they are, that they discover new and exciting things every day and apply them in the production process, there is no limit to economic growth, because then there is no limit to the increase in this technological coefficient, in the efficiency with which we use physical stuff. So this coefficient is actually how good we are in transforming physical stuff from one shape to another, from producer goods to consumer goods. Okay. So now, what is the relationship between changes in production? This is just one smaller technical point. It should be obvious, but I will just say it anyway. If we want to connect our aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework we discussed thus far to the production function analysis, so what we can do is to say that if you go from Q1 to Q2, by increasing the amount of labor, let's say from L1 to L2, you move along the given production function, then the long run aggregate supply curve will shift from Q1 to Q2. So you will remember now, long run aggregate supply curve is this stubborn vertical curve that cannot be changed by monetary and fiscal policy. Remember that all analysis that we did on business cycle is how to actually bring back the aggregate demand and aggregate supply, short-term aggregate supply, on this vertical curve. And we said remember, I repeated that 5, 6 times at least, if not more, that this vertical curve is the level of productivity that a country can have depending on real factors like technology, labor force, capital, and so on. And here is the proof, actually. Here is the proof. So once your quantity of goods that are produced changes from point 1 to point 2, your long run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. So this shows that the long-term economic growth is possible only if you do something with the real stuff, if you have more labor force, or if you have more capital goods. How can you have more capital goods? Foreigners, for example, buy stocks and bonds of your companies, on our companies, and our companies then buy more machines and tools and invest more to increase production. Or we save more money and consume less money, and then we invest more money in making machines and tools that we use in the production process. Or if we increase technological sophistication of our economy. So something real has to happen, real factors have to be improved upon in order for a long run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. So that's now the explanation of what determines the position of this long run aggregate supply curve. So it's vertical, it means that real GDP is in the horizontal axis, that you cannot do anything by way of monetary or fiscal policy, by manipulating price level. You cannot touch it in the long run. How much stuff you produce is determined by capital, labor, and available technology. That's the main point of superimposing these two curves on one another. It simply means that long run productivity, long run GDP, real GDP in a given country is determined by real factors, not by monetary and fiscal policy. But you see what is here long run aggregate supply curve shifts because you increase the use of labor. But the same thing happens here. The curve doesn't know this situation here from this one here. In other words, the long run aggregate supply curve, the natural level of productivity of the economy will be the same whether you came to this Q2 point by moving alongside a given production function, by increasing the amount of labor, by working more, or, for example, by increasing the technological sophistication of your economy and working the same number of labor hours. In both cases, the long run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right because you make more stuff. You go from Q1 to Q2. The curves do not care whether you went from Q1 to Q2, from lower GDP to higher GDP by working more, by working hard more, or by having better tools and machines. It's the same. The final result is the same. Now, labor. What are the factors that may influence the quantity of labor? So I was talking here about the changes in quantity of labor in a rather imprecise fashion that left impression that this might be just people working more or having a higher population and so on. So now let's make it precise what we mean by saying that quantity of labor went from L1 to L2. What exactly do we mean by that? We mean that number of labor hours worked will increase. That's what it means. It doesn't necessarily mean that more people will be working. So it could mean that you simply have more workers, you import the immigrants, and then you have a larger quantity of labor, but it may mean that the same population will decide to work more. So now, if we assume that Population hasn't changed. What can influence the quantity of labor that will be available on the market? So let's say this situation, shifting from one position to another, labor one to labor two. So supply of labor will change, that we see on the image number 1A here, that plots the wage rate against the quantity of labor. It's the decrease in taxes. If taxes on labor income go down, then people will decide to work more, of course. If the for example, if the payroll taxes were reduced, imagine that the government, they were gonna reduce payroll taxes that all workers and their employers pay for Social Security and Medicare. And let's say that these taxes are reduced by 50%. They are now about 13%, 12.8. Let's say they're reduced to 7%. So what's going to happen then? So now the employers will be motivated to shift the balance, to shift the combination of factors that they use towards labor. They would be employing maybe the maximum number 100,000 workers in North Dakota with a tax 12%. But then if the tax goes to 7%, then employers do not care whether they're going to pay $1,000 to rent or buy a machine that will produce 5 hamburgers per hour, or they're going to pay a wage to somebody $1,000 who is going to produce 5 hamburgers by working manually per hour. For them, it doesn't matter. For what matters for them is the money cost of production that they have to pay, whether they pay in wages or they pay it in rents or selling prices of machines that they have to install. So then, with a given amount of taxes, they're going to employ, let's say, 55 workers in a given factory and to use 26 machines. And then, if you reduce the taxes on labor income, this will change the calculation that employers have. Now it gets cheaper to hire more labor. Labor costs go down, so then there will be a shift, there will be a switch, there will be the substitution effect, as it is called in economics. So they're going to substitute some of the machines with some of the workers, because workers now become comparatively cheaper. Now you don't have to pay, when you pay, those of you who have parents or friends who run businesses, you know that when you pay a worker, for you it doesn't matter how much you pay in salaries and how much you pay in taxes to the government. All of that is just a labor cost for you. So if you have to pay $5,000 in labor cost per employee, if they reduce the amount of taxes that you pay, that's just a lower labor cost per head for you. So you're going to employ now, instead of 55, 56, 57, or 58 workers, depending on the calculation. Maybe 60, we don't know. But the supply of labor will increase, which means the amount of people who are employed will be increased. Or maybe you're not going to increase the number of workers, you're going to increase the labor hours of existing workers. If you're allowed legally to do that, maybe the existing workers would want to work more, and you will pay them more now because you can afford it. Now you can pay the same number of workers to work more, and you can sell off 1 or 2 machines and get some money, some profit. So you're a greedy bastard employer, capitalist. You want to earn money. How you earn money if the government reduces taxes on labor, payroll taxes, by rewarding your employees, by giving them more money, or by employing new people who are without work and paying them to work for you. That's why in this image 1, the supply of labor will shift to the right. So then supply of labor, when the tax rates go down, will increase. And then the quantity of produced stuff will increase because the quantity of labor has increased. And then when we talk about the economy as a whole, so then we will have a greater employment of labor, long run aggregate supply curve will increase. Okay, about capital. Now the capital is also very important for economic growth. Physical capital, which means the machines, tools, buildings, and so on, physical infrastructure. The main thing that influences the supply of capital in an economy and the possibility to increase economic growth by changing capital or interest rates. Obviously, everything that savings rates that then influence the interest rates. When the savings rate goes up, when people save more money, if they have a fixed income and they decide to increase their savings rate, which means the percentage of their total income devoted to saving, there will be more investment. There will be first more saving in the banking and financial system. The supply of savings will go up with a given demand. That means that the price of money will go down, that the interest rate will go down. So more savings will mean lower interest rates. Lower interest rates in most situations will entail a greater demand for loans. The greater supply and greater quantity of money being exchanged on the credit market, which means the greater amount of credits being extended, greater amount of loans being extended to private firms, which means then greater purchases of capital goods and greater investment. Of course, human capital, that's another thing that it is not quite clear actually how to define human capital. Human capital will be the quality of labor, let's say. So here we assumed in all this analysis that the quantity of labor will increase. So we assume for the purposes of analysis that all units of labor are alike. So we don't control for the quality of labor. But here we have to be more realistic and to realize that not all workers are equally productive. In other words, it's not only technology and the quality of capital goods with which they work that contribute to labor productivity. So we know that one and the same worker will produce more wheat if she works with combine harvesters and tractors and modern machinery than if she works with the shovels and other hand tools. We know that better technology and better capital goods, more productive a worker is. But it's not only that. It's also that better workers, you need somebody who will be capable of using more sophisticated capital goods. For a software engineer is a more productive, or let's say technologically literate person has a higher human capital than technologically illiterate person in a modern society. So education, training, and experience contribute to human capital, to the value of wages that people can command on the market. So that's one of the intangibles that we don't know exactly how to quantify and measure. It's difficult. We can only qualitatively say that education, training, intelligence, entrepreneurial skills, experience all increase human capital. So those are all intangible, difficult to quantify human capacities and abilities that increase labor productivity of workers and productivity of entrepreneurs, their ability to earn profit. So the theory, so you see, these are some of the main ideas: technology, labor, capital, human capital that contribute to long-term economic growth. This theory that emphasizes there are two generations of theories, or maybe even three generations of theories that explained economic growth. The first generation was this neoclassical growth theory that emphasizes the entire production function stuff and capital and labor. It began originally with just capital and labor. And the main controversy was, the main idea was how to combine capital and labor for long-term economic growth. You have only labor and capital. Technology was taken to be exogenous, which means that it is given in advance and unchanging. So then the only strategy for long-term economic growth was to either increase the labor, increase the size of population, or to increase the amount of capital. The only way how you could theoretically have shifted the production function of your economy upwards, which means create the ability to produce the same level of output by increasing capital, rather to produce the same level of output without increasing labor, was to increase capital. And then the policy prescription was that the conclusion was that the poverty of poor countries in Africa, for example, was caused by the lack of capital goods, machines, tools, buildings, infrastructure, physical infrastructure, airports, roads, and so on. So then the policy prescription stemming from this was that we need a capital transfer. So we need to move machines and tools and capital goods from wealthy countries to poor countries in order to allow them to catch up with the West. So this was the idea behind this foreign aid doctrine, to give the money, to give the capital to poor countries in order to allow them to catch up by increasingly using capital goods instead of labor, to become capital intensive, to use more capital, to combine more capital with less labor in order to make the same level of production. So that was the idea. Catch-up growth, neoclassical growth theory. Now, that changed for two reasons. There are two reasons why this growth theory is faulty, is not good enough. The first, we already seen that there is a third factor here that have been shown to have been endogenous, which means it's not given, it's not fixed, it's changing all the time. That's technology. So technological productivity is crucially important, not only physical amount of capital goods. And then if that's the case, then your policy prescription changes. Then the transfer of technology became the main idea, which is a lot cheaper. You give them the ability to make computers, or to use computers. You don't need to transfer, you don't need to invest trillions of dollars to build factories and airports and roads. That's relatively less important. Physical infrastructure is less important. This intellectual, technological know-how and infrastructure, that's much more important. And then the influence of ideas becomes more important. If you have the power to innovate and to create new knowledge and to create a new technological application of this scientific knowledge, you may be doing much better than somebody who has all kinds of natural resources and physical infrastructure and powerful roads and airports and factories and all kinds of physical stuff that is useless, that is not producing anything good and sophisticated that you can sell on the international market. So this is the knowledge-based, technology-based, smart growth, as they say. So now that was the second generation of growth theories, or the first important revision of this institutional growth theory. Technology is important and knowledge is important. Now, the third generation that became obvious, that became crystal clear, especially after the breakdown of communism in 1980s and 1990s, was that there is something even more important, potentially even more important than knowledge and technology, and that's institutions. That institutions matter for the ability of an economy to grow in the long run. and this should be obvious. Sometimes it's a mystery how economists can miss something so obvious and close in hand for such a long period of time, for essentially 3 4 years. The role of institutions was routinely downplayed. So what are the institutions that are necessary for a long-term economic growth, that are independent variable, that are completely independent factor from everything else, from the quantity of capital goods, from technological development? These factors, these institutions are influence economic growth in the long run utterly independently. So these are private property rights structure. So it is discovered that the countries without the system of private property rights, efficient system of private property rights, are doing much worse than the countries with such a system in place. The legal system, which means contract enforcement, the rule of law, the absence of corruption, that's hugely, hugely important. These first two things are impossible to overstate. How large effect do they have? So the rule of law and private property rights. There is one Peruvian economist, uh, Hernando de Soto, who studied the causes of the causes of poverty in Latin American countries and some African countries. And what he discovered was shocking in a sense for the entire um, economic policy establishment in the West, was that the single most important reason why poor countries are stuck in poverty has nothing to do with the lack of capital goods. It has even less to do with ideas and technology. It has to do with the lack of private property rights and the legal system and protection of contracts and private property rights. That one of the main reasons why people cannot get out of the circle of poverty is that they don't have, in countries like Brazil and Bolivia and Peru, they don't have private property rights on land and their houses in which they live. So they cannot use them as a mortgage for their business loans. So then the small and medium-sized business enterprise, that is the bloodstream of all advanced economies, cannot take root in these countries because the poor people are prevented by the legal obstacles, by the absence of credible private property rights, to use their property as a, what is it called, as a mortgage for their loan, uh, for their loans that they would be taking as business entrepreneurs. So this is one of the main reasons why these countries are poor. Another aspect of that is, if you have imagine now the motivation when you have a highly corrupt country that nationalizes property, that arbitrarily taxes people, that doesn't respect contracts and property rights, and that requires huge bribes in order to give you certain privileges or just to let you do your job. Imagine how many good, powerful corporations will decide to expand their business operations in such countries. Very few of them. So in the modern world, which is the world of globalization, in which capital doesn't know for borders, economic growth is crucially predicated on your ability to attract the foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment, which means to people who build factories, manufactories, and plants, and who directly invest in physical production in your country, but also means people who transfer money in your country, who buy shares and stocks and bonds in your country. So if you don't have stable private property rights and legal system, very few foreigners will invest in your country. So now you know which country has the greatest amount of foreign direct investment as a percentage of its GDP. It's the United States of America. And why is that the case? Because the foreign investor knows that whatever she buys in New York or Los Angeles or Houston or Bismarck, North Dakota, that's his or her forever. The government is not going to confiscate that. They know that legal rights are sacrosanct. They know that you can enforce a contract against somebody who owes you money, the debtor. You know, if you're a bondholder and the corporation goes bankrupt, you're first in line to receive your money. You know that your investment is secure. So investment in bonds is a huge source of income for American corporation and source of jobs for American workers, incidentally, and source of our economic growth. So bond market doesn't mean a thing if you don't have stable bankruptcy rules and credible bankruptcy rules that allow you as the bondholder to get your money back if a corporation goes belly up. So these things are not so visible and are not so fancy that are routinely discussed and are not so easy to model. They're not so easy to analyze quantitatively, but they're hugely important for economic growth. So legal system, private property rights, contract enforcement, and so on, bankruptcy rules, the absence of corruption, but also growth promoting policies, which means what we can call economic freedom. What that means? That means low regulations, low taxes, and relatively manageable extent of government spending. So that growth promoting policies have to do with primarily reasonable regulation. Why is that an institutional factor of economic growth? How many new firms are going to spring up if you increase regulation that makes the costs of setting up and starting up a new firm very high, much less than before? How many firms from other countries will consider relocating to your country if your regulations and your taxes are much higher? Not many of them, but if your taxes are competitive, if your taxes are lower, then you will have a much higher rate of economic growth vis-a-vis other countries, all other things being equal. So that's why, for example, Texas is growing economically much faster than California, because it has much more reasonable regulations. Actually, there's very few regulations. I have a friend in Texas who's a professor of economics, and he said to me about 5 or 6 years ago, I don't know whether that's the case still, that Texas is very proud to publish its business regulations every year. And you know what are their business regulations? Like an empty piece of paper, blank piece of paper. So very few business regulations, very low taxes. It shouldn't shock you now that Houston and Dallas and Austin become the new centers not only of trade and commerce, but also of culture, and many artists are moving there in education and all kinds of other things. That Texas is a major hub of the world economy, the seventh largest economy in the world. And reasonable business regulations. So Texans are not in and of themselves smarter or better educated than Californians or New Yorkers, and they don't have more people than California, and they don't have better technology. After all, the Silicon Valley is in California, and so on. What they have are better institutions. So you have that phenomenon in a kind of decentralized federal country like the United States, that better institutions and more growth promoting policies such as lower taxes, lower spending, and more limited regulation increase economic growth. That's even more so the case in institutional context. Transfer promoting policies are actually harmful for economic growth. So that means that if you increase taxes and you increase the amount of redistribution of wealth, your economic growth is going to suffer. So that's typically why the Western European heavily regulated and very high spending and high tax countries have rates of economic growth typically twice lower than the United States. That's the main reason. So we have to be careful here. I'm not saying that American policies and American economic model is better than the European or morally superior, or that you should promote the American system vis-a-vis Western European, but I'm saying just that you have to make a trade-off. America decided to have a higher rate of economic growth in the long run and lower level of government spending and government interference, and Europe decided the opposite. We as economists cannot tell which one is better. Maybe we need, as Bernie Sanders, for example, said, okay, let it be. If we need a level of taxation as Denmark has it, in order to fund my Medicare for all system and all other kinds of government goodies that I'm promising, so be it. So 3 times, 4 times higher taxes in the United States for everybody, if that's what it takes to create the welfare state of the Scandinavian type, so be it. So we as economists cannot say whether Bernie Sanders is right in arguing for that kind of policy. The only thing that we can say is that that kind of policy is inconsistent in the long run with high economic growth. It doesn't mean that you should choose and that you should believe that economic growth is more important than whatever redistribution of income or social justice or lowering down inequality. So you're perfectly free to pick and choose whichever value you consider more important, but you are not free to pick and choose your own facts. And the facts are actually that growth promoting policies of economic freedom, low taxes, low regulation, and low government spending encourage economic growth. Whereas the opposite of that encourages lower economic growth. Other institutions are, for example, foreign trade, foreign international trade. So next week we will be dealing with international trade and international financial system. So stable monetary system, that's another institution. So if you have inflation, then it won't help you very much to have all other institutions, right? And to have the best educated labor force in the world and to have the best technological equipment that you can have. If you have 3,000% inflation per year, everything is gonna get wrecked very quickly. So, or also if you shut down your economy completely, you're gonna suffer terribly, no matter what other factors influence your economic development. Okay, so that's all I've got for today. Just one note for you at the very end. I'm starting to get some of the questions for you already, so I strongly encourage you to use the discussion form that I posted on Canvas, or to email me, or to send your questions in any form or shape that you want. And I will be more than willing to answer these questions as they come in the coming days. So next week I will. So the questions might be about this lecture, about something else. I got even one question about the midterms, some questions on the midterm. So anything going forward, preparing for the final exam, any questions that you might have, any clarification that you need. I cannot know this way what did you get correctly, what you understood, what may need some further clarification on my side, maybe something that I said was not clear enough. So please don't hesitate to send me your questions and comments. I will be answering them and post in this same form as the videos, and posting them in some succession in the coming days and weeks. And I hope that that can also be of some use for your preparations for the final exam. So please, any questions that you might have about anything pertaining to this material, pertaining to the homework, pertaining to the final exam, don't hesitate to write down your questions. Or if you want to talk with me about it directly, just send me an email or a Canvas notification, and I will be willing to meet you online. But at any rate, it might be useful, even if you want to talk with me, to write down your questions, so then I can answer them in a video and post it on Canvas for other people to see the question and answer. So it might be useful for somebody else. Maybe somebody else has the same dilemma or the same question that you have, but hesitated to ask, or maybe was not aware that this was a problem, and then once they saw the question, they realized that that was something that they also needed the clarification with. So please, I implore you and I appeal to you to not to miss the chance and send me all the questions and comments that you have, and I will be answering them shortly. Okay, bye bye for now.